Minutes past 9, a little bit earlier this morning before we came on air, Owen caught up with a friend of the show, Ryan Farmer-Jones, editor emeritus of Slam magazine. Here he is reacting to the death of Kobe Bryant and why he was still such a hugely prominent figure in American life.
I was had a lot of conversations with a lot of friends and former coworkers and people around basketball today, and a couple of different people sort of made that point that, you have a guy who's such a high-level athlete and so prominent and so well-known and so accomplished for 20 years, and then they retire, after a few years, and you think, well, you'll have this person will be around. I think he was 5 years younger than me, so you think you'll have this person around most of the rest of your life. You'll be able to sort of ponder their accomplishments and see what else they're going to do, in retirement. Kobe had a lot of different things going on, and so yeah, it's just kind of crazy. It makes it that much more crazy because he still seemed a guy who had a lot going on, was still very active, was an ambitious guy, wanted to be involved in entertainment and business and all sorts of things. And then obviously the worst part of this is that, a guy with 4 daughters, coaching one of them, and had a family still to raise. And so, yeah, that's made it a surreal thing just that much worse.
You mentioned there that you're of a similar age to Kobe Bryant. I'm sure as a sports writer, as a basketball writer, he was a central thread in your career as well. You would have seen him from the hugely prominent high school career he had, the huge story that it was with him skipping college as a guard at the time. That was a particularly seismic moment for the NBA. Can you talk us through a little bit like that about his career arc and probably how your own career arc went along with that as well?
Yeah, I was remembering earlier. I actually saw him play 1/4 of a game in high school, just 1/4. It was a playoff game, and I was working my first job out of college, and I was covering a different high school tournament, a state tournament game in Pennsylvania, and his team was in the next gym. So I went to watch, and I saw him play 1/4, and I think his team was winning 20-0 at the end of the first quarter. I think he had 12 or 14 points, but just clearly dominated. He looked like he could have gone 1 on 10. He was so good. And then I didn't really, his first few years of the NBA, wasn't too close, but I was a Laker fan. I'd grown up a Laker fan, so he was sort of my new favorite player. And then I got to Slam in 1999 and covered him pretty extensively while I was at Slam and spent a fair amount of time around him. And we, did a few, feature interviews for stories in Slam. And so, yeah, I don't think I got to know him well, and I'm not sure anybody really did. That was part of what made him interesting, is that he was a tough guy to sort of really get to know. He was something of a enigma is not the right word necessarily, but he was just a really complex guy. And I think he sort of famously early in his career, even his teammates were like, "Yeah, this guy doesn't want to hang out with us on the road. He's sort of aloof." He was kind of estranged from his family a bit early on. So he had this really interesting background and really interesting story. But a guy, that I had a chance to spend a lot of time with and was obviously very intelligent, very charismatic, as everyone talks about, just a ridiculous competitor. So competitive, relentlessly competitive. Obviously did not go through his career without some controversy, which is a light way of putting it. But that, sort of hung over him for the second half of his career. But he kept going and sort of just on the strength of winning and sort of being so relentless at what he cared about, sort of just made himself this sort of irreplaceable kind of icon in basketball over the past 20 years. Obviously, a lot of people have mixed feelings about aspects of his life, understandably. But as far as his impact on the game, his influence, I was trying to think earlier of a comparison of so much has come out today about the current players in the NBA today who grew up idolizing him and modeling their game on his. And I think it's hard to convey how hard this hit so many current NBA players who maybe, had only met him once or twice, but they grew up wanting to be like Kobe. And a comparison that came to mind would be someone almost like a Thierry Henry. How many strikers growing up, kids over the past, who were kids, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, that would have been the guy they would have wanted to grow up and be. And then imagine having that taken away just a few years after he retired. So his impact on the NBA and this generation of players now was just remarkable and massive, which I think is what makes this kind of all the more poignant.
Yeah, I think that competitor is what a lot of people are going to speak about in the aftermath of all of this. Yeah. I guess, incomparable levels to which he tried to succeed in the game. That obviously created opinions of him when you were up against him, when you were an opposition fan, I'd imagine, where he was always the bad guy on the court. Like, this is something that's probably going to be his legacy on the game. As you mentioned, the kids are not just... The kids that are now the stars in the NBA are not just looking at this guy as an unbelievably talented shooter. They're looking at this guy who brought competitiveness to a whole new level. And I think perhaps if you look through his Lakers career, the post-Shaq era is probably something that he got a lot of joy from personally, because it was about Kobe this time. It wasn't just about Shaquille O'Neal.
Yeah, it was always fascinating to watch. And again, I was a Laker fan when they first got together. And so I sort of, to watch that. And as a Laker fan, you just wanted it to work. You didn't care if they liked each other, right? You just wanted it to work and see them succeed. But when Shaq left, and that was around the time that then he and I had talked a fair amount, I'd had a chance to have a lot of access to him. And there was that sort of constant fight you could see with him. He wanted to win more than anything. And having Shaq next to him helped him win. But he also wanted to do it on his own terms, and he wanted to be the guy. And he couldn't do that as long as Shaq was there. So when Shaquille O'Neal left and Kobe was clearly the guy on those teams, he still needed help. But that was sort of another level to him that you saw that he really, and it was, that Jordan, that career-long comparison to Michael Jordan, he replicated Jordan as closely as anyone ever could have. And to be able to then have a team where, again, post-Shaq, like you said, they were clearly his teams, and he was clearly the guy. You really got to see him sort of at his peak as a competitor.
Yeah, you mentioned there as well the sort of level to which he'd gone to post-career. I think, he skipped college. If he'd gone through college, I think the general consensus is that he would have flown through it, that he was gifted no matter what he was going to do. He was a smart guy. Can you talk us through what he had done post-career? Winning an Oscar, all that sort of stuff, that had actually shown Kobe Bryant as a man who was going to succeed in business. He could have become a coach, he could have become a GM. Who knows what he was going to do if he'd gone back into basketball. But he had shown so many characteristics off the court that he was going to succeed.
Yeah, I was actually about a month ago, right before Christmas here, I was out in California visiting family, and a friend of mine, a former coworker of mine from Slam, now works for Kobe's company. And so my family and I had a chance to kind of tour his office, and I think we missed Kobe by 10 minutes. That afternoon. I hadn't seen him in years, and we missed him that day. But my friend who works for him now sort of gave us the tour of his space there, his office space in Southern California, and he's got sort of studio space, and there's creative space for people editing videos, which ESPN used, where Kobe would analyze things, and there was just all these levels of Kobe's creativity and his business acumen and his competitiveness, all sort of coming together in this space. And he had this team of people who worked for him, and you just got a sense of his vision. It was very much about the things he wanted to do, the things he cared about. They were working on editing a documentary that I assume will still come out at some point on his final NBA season. And my friend who worked there made the point. He's like, if you look at all the things like LeBron is doing, for example, LeBron is big on partnering with big established, entertainment things or businesses, which is fine. Whereas Kobe's thing was he wants to do all those things on his own. He wants to be his vision. And that's very consistent with my experience with him when we were at Slam. He was trying to dictate cover choices for us. Other athletes didn't do that. So he was just a very unique guy that way. And I think it was a pretty high ceiling as far as what he might have continued to do in his career. It was going to be whatever he wanted to do, he would have pulled off.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess kind of a couple of points to wrap up then. You mentioned Southern California there. You can just imagine the scenes there over the last 12 hours or so. It's a place that fell in love with Kobe Bryant, I think it's fair to say. I think when we talk about the basketball player and how a lot of people would have seen him as the basketballing villain as their opposition teams, you flip that in Southern California as a Lakers fan yourself. What has that reaction been like from the people you've spoken to in that part of the world right now?
That's really one of the things that's been driven home. I'm from Southern California. I haven't lived there in many years, but I'm from out there. Again, I grew up a huge Laker fan. And someone today on Twitter actually made the point that, Los Angeles is this massive spread out area with, 20 million people or something, and so diverse and so, diverse economically and and racially and ethnically, and just so spread out. It sprawls and sprawls and sprawls over hundreds of miles. And it's not crazy to say that the Lakers are almost the only sort of entity or institution that really unites that whole area. Sort of everyone's a Laker fan in Southern California. They've been so good for so long, and had so many compelling, iconic, great players. So, and Kobe was that guy for 20 years. So if you grew up, if you were born in the past 30 or 35 years, Kobe was your guy on this team that united your entire area in a way that nothing else did, politically, socially, culturally. So it's, I think, hard, as big of a deal as he is nationally, even internationally. I think for folks in Southern California, it's hard to comprehend how big this is for them. And I mean, the outpouring, I think, of grief and shock and all that. I think you saw a bit of that today, but I think you'll see a lot more of it over the coming days. It's just he was huge and iconic and beloved really throughout that area. Yeah,
it's actually just interesting that you mentioned the timeline here as well. There is one of the kind of lesser points in all of this is how Bryant has navigated his way through a whole new series of technologies as a sports person, and as somebody involved in the media yourself, you're probably well placed to speak on this, how he'd gone from the poster boy of the print world to now the Instagram world, which obviously basketball fits so perfectly within. And you have kids who recognize Kobe as a brand, and you have people in their mid-40s to 60s who would have been kids as fans of Kobe, getting their news through the print medium, I guess, when he first came along.
Yeah, he really, his career kind of covered that whole span, like you said. I mean, as a rookie in 1996, Slam, our magazine, had just started 2 years earlier, so he was one of the guys very early on with Slam, where for us it was all about our covers and our posters that kids could hang on their walls, and he was a star for us both on our covers and the posters and the kind of photos we would choose in the magazine. We always knew we could count on amazing Kobe action shots. And then as it started to turn into an internet thing, the YouTube highlights of his are legendary. A lot of those have been flying around today. And then, you get into the social media age. My own son is 15 years old. And he really only knows Kobe as a guy that he's seen highlights of on Instagram, but he knows from that this guy was something special. So there's just these layers. There's these layers to his career and the eras that he spanned. And like you were saying, again, he was going to be, he was clearly already in his post-playing career focused on, sort of creating these new chapters for himself where he was going to make an impact in entertainment and business and who knows what else.
Has there been a more compelling American athlete?
I think I said that today, and I don't think there has been in my lifetime. And listen, that's good and bad, right? I mean, this was a guy who was credibly accused of sexual assault 17 or 18 years ago, whatever it was, and that was a huge, obviously, turning point in his career that people sort of didn't know if he would come back from, and he did, and it was, obviously never went to court, settled, so. Obviously that understandably creates difficult feelings for people. But from his personal background, a kid who was basically born and raised overseas in Italy when his father was playing professionally for much of his childhood, and then to come back to America as an African-American kid who hadn't spent that much time in sort of the dominant African-American culture, especially, that was predominant in basketball and in hip-hop at the time, and to be a peer of someone like Allen Iverson, who was kind of iconic for the sort of hip hop vibe that was kind of taken over basketball at that time. And he wasn't sort of born into that in the way a lot of guys were, but he adapted to it and embraced it. And people forget a lot of people had a hard time embracing Kobe for who he was earlier in his career. There was a lot of skepticism about him, that he was a guy who just tried to emulate Michael Jordan and didn't really sort of come to the culture of basketball at the time naturally and sincerely in a way. A lot of people don't forget. I think a lot of people forget that about him. And he, again, I said earlier, kind of just through force of will and just relentlessly winning and competing the way he did, kind of just negated all those questions about where he was from or what he was about, because it was just such respect for how competitive and relentless and great he was. And what a winner he was, obviously. And so a lot of those other doubts and that skepticism about him kind of disappeared over time in a way that even now I'm thinking about it, it's kind of you sort of forget about it,
Yeah.
that there were ever any questions about Kobe sort of belonging in a way, and there really were early on. So yeah, to your question, I think just an incredibly compelling character in American sports and international sports, as big as basketball is. I mean, someone was talking to someone earlier who made the point, when this news were to sort of hit China, when China wakes up, he was huge, massive in China, and that's such a massive market for the NBA as well. So, yeah, his reach, I think, has been profound, and his story and his character through all this has been a fascinating thing to follow. I've been lucky, I think, to follow him for, almost 25 years in one form or another, and yeah, just very sad about this right now.
Yeah, like just because you mentioned it there a couple of times, like it's a tricky thing to talk about, I guess, or some people don't want to talk about in the immediate aftermath of such a tragedy, because it is a tragedy. Yeah. But when it comes to the sexual assault allegation, like it is something that has marked his career with a bad mark really down through the years. It's something that you can accept as a horrible thing that has happened, and at the same time also analyse the failings in Kobe Bryant's own life and his own career. Both of these things can be true. You can appreciate the tragedy as well that has happened last night. Like, this is going to affect the legacy. This is going to affect how people speak about Kobe Bryant. And I just wonder how much is that going to permeate into what we see on the ground, especially in somewhere like Southern California, where he is a god.
Right. I mean, I think for the most part, basketball people, basketball fans, other players, basketball media, for the most part, are not going to focus on that. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be a mention in every obituary. I think it has to be, but I don't think it'll be the defining thing for really anybody who's very close to basketball. Again, that's not to minimize what is alleged to have happened. Just to say that if you look at the entirety of his life and career, and how much he accomplished, and obviously it's been fascinating to watch in recent years. He's become such a strong advocate for women's basketball and girls basketball, obviously coaching his daughter, but he's been among the biggest proponents of women's professional basketball and even women's college basketball here. And that's been a real change in recent years for NBA players and former NBA players to embrace the women's league and the women's game. And he was at the forefront of that. So that's part of who he was, as well as being, a loving father of 4 daughters and everything else he's been involved in. So, without judging, I guess you can just sort of acknowledge all of that together as part of who he was. And, again, I think, like you asked earlier, to the extent of what a compelling character he was in so many ways, that thread is a big part of it.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, Ryan Farmer-Jones, it's been great chatting to you. Thanks a million for staying up late for us tonight. Thanks for taking the call.
Thanks, Alan.